everybody. It is really exciting to be with you guys tonight. And yeah, you know, the great thing about working with young people is it keeps you young. So it is funny that I've been working with the student conferences for 20 years. But I started when I was 5. So it's all really good. Tonight I get to talk to you about something I'm pretty psyched about. The name of this talk is 5 Things You Need to Know to Minister to Millennials. There's probably way more than 5 things. But this at least are some of the major things in terms of engaging a new generation. And I find that's one of our biggest challenges in ministry. You know, one of the traps that we face when we start doing ministry is that we often project out of our own autobiography of really everything, you know, and many times our conversations, our relationships. We treat other people in a way that we would like to be treated, or we do things that we think other people would like. I love, you know, one of the books that was so helpful to me in my own marriage, I've been married now for 16 years, is a book called The 5 Love Languages. If you're, you know, I see some nodding heads, a lot of people are familiar with that. And what I loved about that book was it was just an understanding that the way I receive love and give love might be different than the way somebody else would like to receive love or would like to give love. And just that simple understanding, like I remember, you know, learning about that in my pre-Cana class, and that just unlocked a whole world of insight for me, especially in youth ministry, that we're just so commonly by default acting out of our own autobiography, acting out of our own understanding. How many times in youth ministry do we make decisions about what we think would work or not work based on what we think would have worked for us or what didn't work for us when we were teenagers? And I think in ministry, especially with young people, that is the constant bias that we need to keep fighting. That we would just think, well, I wouldn't like that when I was a teen. Or we try to recreate things that were really effective for us when we were teenagers. And so that's what I want to try to address tonight, because if we're not conscious of that, if we're not careful of that, then we're just going to be caught replicating whatever ministry things were effective or would have been effective to us when we were in high school. And so the first of the 5 things that I want to talk about is that we have to understand that young people today, they're not like you, and they're not like me. I spent a good 10 years doing youth ministry in a parish, and I was very blessed to be, have some good success with it and have a good response with young people. And I always feel like one of the things that was most successful for me when I was in youth ministry is the fact that I've never actually instinctively known what is cool ever. Like when I was in high school, no way. You know, like here's a snapshot of my life. I play the accordion, I wear bow ties, I'm in a role-playing group, okay? Like these are not like anything that would ever be cool. And actually the interesting thing is bow ties are cool now because of Doctor Who, but it's gonna move on and it's not gonna be cool anymore. I'm like a broken clock. It's cool, Andy. All right, so we'll break into small groups and talk about it later. But the point is, like actually not being cool, speaking of Andy, so Bob Lesneski, Andy's brother, was in a parish next to me, and Bob is just intrinsically hip. Like he's just a cool guy. And so like, for example, I would like spend weeks designing what I thought would be like the perfect youth group t-shirt, you know, like the font, and it would just be awesome. And I think it would be amazing. Andy's brother, Bob, he would put like buckwheat like on the cover of the t-shirt and be like, "Doi!" And that would be his youth group t-shirt. And all my kids in my parish would be like trading their t-shirts for like Bob's youth group. And I'd always be really upset about that. Thanks for this healing moment. I feel like I had a breakthrough in group. Anyway, but part of what was really good for me is that because I've never actually trusted my own like internal compass on what I think a young person would like, I've always had to research. I've always felt the desperate need to research. It's something I find, you know, I teach youth ministry at Franciscan, and it's a big struggle for me to convince these 21 and 22-year-olds that, look, you don't know youth culture. They still think they're kind of in it. And in a bigger picture, you'd consider young 20 peoples in youth culture. But when you're talking about high school kids, it's like you got to go back to basics, and you really have to research. In some way, I think it's a little bit helpful if you realize that you're totally clueless and uncool, because then you have a shot, I think, of having a humble attitude, of searching for it. Matthew chapter 16. Jesus was talking to the Pharisees at this point, but he said this. He said, in the evening you say, it'll be fine, there's a red sky. In the morning you say, stormy weather today, the sky is red and overcast. You know how to read the face of the sky, but you can't read the signs of the times. Okay, so the first thing you need to know about millennials is you need to know that they're not like you. And I just read this scripture verse that Jesus was chastising the Pharisees at the time by saying, you can read the sides of the time, but you can't read what's going on in the faith. And I think sometimes that chastisement could be directed towards us working with young people, that we can get so caught up in our own mentality of how we used to do things or the way young people used to be that we don't read the signs of the times. We don't see where young people are at. We don't try to engage them in a way that really is relevant to them. There's a wonderful book that I would suggest, well, there's a number of books I'll suggest you read. This one is a quote from a book called Almost Christian by Kendra Casey Dean. And she wrote that today adolescence is a moving target. Puberty starts earlier and adulthood starts later. Fertility and adolescence no longer go hand in hand. And that used to be the defining principle of what it meant to be an adolescent. When you're in puberty, now you're an adolescent. That's been separated now. And in fact, even when you would think adolescence would end, it continues going on in culture. Scholars now posit emerging adulthood as a youthful life stage of its own. Since the developmental tasks once associated with identity are increasingly postponed, most young Americans eschew the title of adult until their late 20s or early 30s. We have learned to accept 21 as the new 16. Today, adolescence functions as a lifestyle as well as a life stage, a state of consciousness, as well as a period of life that young people can and often do prolong with the full cooperation of American culture. See, that's a very unique thing that we see. We, those of us in Generation X, started to taste this a little bit. But one of the major things of millennials is that they like being young and they want to stay being young. And they never want to stop being young. And that idea really manifests itself in the entire culture. And there's a whole marketing machine that wants to keep them young because they spend more money when they're young before they have quote-unquote responsibilities. And so this idea, this mentality of trying to bring young people into adulthood is something that they actually don't want to do. They don't want to be an adult. I remember when I was younger, I was really excited about being an adult. I thought it's going to be cool someday when I'm an adult. And a young person today is like, that sounds horrible. It's Peter Pan syndrome on steroids. Because they're enjoying where they're at right now, and in some ways they have some fears about what's it going to be like when they get into adulthood. When the General Directory of Catechesis, which was published in the mid-90s, talked about reaching out to young people, it encouraged this idea of being a missionary to young people. I quote, "It must be emphasized, however, that frequently contemporary evangelization of young people must adopt a missionary dimension rather than a strictly catechetical dimension. Indeed, the situation often demands that the apostolate among young people be an animation of a missionary or humanitarian nature as a necessary first step to bring to maturity those dispositions favorable to the catechetical moment." I think that piece of wisdom that the General Directory of Catechesis mentioned, we could really learn from. And in some ways, I think it's fallen on deaf ears in the United States and in some other cultures as well. This Vatican document about catechesis is saying, when you're thinking of teenagers, you need to be thinking more missionary than catechetical. In the United States, we have this dearth of catechetical materials. You know, you type in adolescent catechesis in Google, and you will get 100,000 hits. Type in adolescent evangelization, and you won't get many hits at all. And most of the hits will be on a workshop I gave at NCYC. I mean, it's really kind of a crazy thing. Like it'll be under 100 hits. Because that's just not the language that we're used to in the United States. And we have this really big push of education. But this missionary attitude that the Vatican talks about, which I think is very apropos to our culture, is in many ways just a paradigm shift that we have to have. I mean, we don't think of ourselves being a missionary because they seem to be living in the same world that we are. But of course, all of you who work with young people know that's not true. They have different symbols, different signs, different history, different language. And so I really believe the most effective way to reach out to millennials is to treat them as if you're going to another country and not fool yourself into thinking that you know what they are going through. You know, it's like you need to learn a new language. You need to learn a new culture. You need to learn all of these things going on. And we have to approach reaching out to young people from a more missionary mindset. We have to dissuade ourselves from thinking, oh, well, I was a teenager once, so I know what they're going through. That's not a very effective way to do ministry, though there are certainly things in commonality. I'm not throwing everything out. But at least in the way in which they perceive the world and the language in which they would articulate their experience, it's very, very different from the way we did. And I know there's a lot of different ages, but I would even say if you're 5 years removed from high school, it's very, very different. You know, I think some of us who are older at least know it's different, and we're going into that attitude. Because the goal of evangelization is not just to evangelize the person, but to evangelize the culture. This is what Paul VI wrote in Evangelii Nuntiandi. He said, "The kingdom which the gospel proclaims is lived by men who are profoundly linked to a culture, and the building up of the kingdom cannot avoid borrowing the elements of human culture or cultures. Though independent of cultures, the gospel and evangelization are not necessarily incompatible with them. Rather, they are capable of permeating them all without becoming subject to them." Now, of course, Paul VI was talking about that more proper missionary understanding of going into a foreign country or going into a place untouched by the gospel. But what he wrote in the 70s, I think, is very valid in, 2014, as we talk about reaching into youth culture, that we have to think that we're not just evangelizing the young person. We're evangelizing a young person in the context of their culture. They are linked to their culture. They are a part of their culture. We have to be very sensitive to it. There's things in their culture that we find ridiculous. One Direction. I mean, that's ridiculous, And yet, if we make fun of One Direction, and maybe some of you have, and that's understandable, but if you make fun of One Direction in front of a group of teenagers, some people will laugh, others will be deeply offended because they have grafted themselves onto this culture as part of their identity. And so when you call something in their culture stupid, you're calling them stupid. And they can't see that, no, I just don't happen to like that music. And so we have to tread very, very carefully when we're dealing with their culture. And the challenge of culture, I think, comes, one of my favorite quotes from the Second Vatican Council, I know we all have them, is from a document called Ad Gentes, which is about missionary activity. And it said in paragraph 11, it said, the goal of the missionary is to lay bare the seeds of the word of God that lie hidden among their friends. It's this idea that it's really easy to critique a culture, and there's so many things you can easily critique about, what's going on with young people. But the challenge of a missionary is to go into the culture, kind of dig around a little bit. That means our hands get dirty. And we find something of God within the culture, and we go, hey, look, God's there. That's the real challenge of a missionary. And that should be our attitude. That's a very Catholic attitude, by the way. I was very blessed when I was in high school. My deeper conversion to faith came about through Young Life, a number of evangelical Protestants. And so I might compare Catholicism and Protestantism sometimes. And if I ever sound like I'm trying to be negative, I'm not. I'm just trying to make the comparison because I'm here today because of men and women who were part of that movement that really reached out to me, not only wanting me to know about Jesus, but actually encouraged me to stay in the Catholic faith. You know, their line to me was, it looks like that church needs people who love Jesus, so you should probably stay there. And I'm grateful for that. But one of the differences, at least in terms of mentality in engaging culture, is that many of our Protestant brothers and sisters want to kind of replicate a Christian culture that's safe to live in. I think the best example of this is a lot of Protestant bookstores, Bible bookstores. You know, if you like Stephen King, you'll love Ted Dekker. You know, I mean, they have all these Christian alternatives to worldly movements that are, quote unquote, safer. And yet the Catholic attitude towards culture has always been to engage and transform. If you ever have a chance to go to Rome, I hope you've had that chance. I hope you get that chance if you haven't. And you take a tour, it's fascinating because you just go to all these places where they used to persecute Christians, and now it's a Christian place. Here's, I remember I was there for the year 2000. We went to the Circus Maximus, which is where they used to persecute and kill Christians, and they were hearing confessions on the lawn. We went to the Castle of St. Michael, which used to be a place where they would torture and imprison Christians, and now it's a convent. Even we lose sight of the fact that Jesus Christ was crucified through the authority of Rome, and now we're part of the Roman Catholic Church. That we're not afraid to engage culture, look it right in the eye, and transform it. We want to be a part of the culture, not separate ourselves. And how many times do we in youth groups even get accused of separating ourselves from the parish, having a little church of young people all to ourselves, and not engaging in the bigger parish community? And much of that has to do with what's going on in the community and what's going on in the faith. But I think this first point is a humble understanding. Man, if I'm going to reach these people, I got to do research. I got to know what they're listening to. I got to watch what they're watching. I think it's important to set a little bit of time aside every day just to try to catch up on trends. You won't enjoy it per se. That's okay. I mean, seriously, this is kind of painful to you. You're like, I have to watch what they're watching. You should. I mean, there's lots of things online that tell you what are the most popular shows that teenagers watch or what the most popular video is. There's a wonderful webpage. It's cpyu.org, Center for Parent and Youth Understanding. It's run by a Protestant guy named Walt Mueller, who does a lot on culture. And every week, he will put up, cpyu.org, he will put up the top videos, the top songs, the top TV shows, the top movies that young people are watching. And I'm not saying you need to get a season subscription to a show that young people watch, but you should watch one episode. That you don't need to keep listening to music that young people watch, but you should see the video. You might be offended by it. That's okay. You're not doing this for your own enjoyment. You're researching the culture. And if you really want to know what young people are watching and listening to, ask them. There's nothing more they would love to talk about than what they're into. And if they feel like you're not going to judge them, they'll really give you an insight into doing that. We'll get to, because the media that they watch, well, this is the second point. They consume a lot of media. This is the second thing you need to know about ministering to millennials. And media is powerful. When St. Paul talked about a deeper conversion to Christ, he said very beautifully, he said this idea that all of us with our unveiled faces like mirrors reflecting the glory of the Lord are being transformed into the image that we reflect in brighter and brighter glory. This is the working of the Lord who is the Spirit. Paul was giving us an analogy that we are like mirrors and we reflect what we're looking at and we're transformed into that image. And of course, in this context, Paul is saying, look at Jesus and you'll be transformed into that image. I would agree with St. Paul that we're all mirrors, but I don't think he would disagree with taking it to the next step, that if we're not looking at Jesus, if we're not looking at things that are holy, we become transformed into that image as well. And that is what's going on with many of our young people. if not all of our young people. There is a quote, there's a book called Dancing in the Dark, and it mentioned this phrase that entertainment is really education. That our young men and women are learning what it means to be a man or what it means to be a woman from what they watch and what they consume in the media, from what they hear in the music, from what they see in the movies, from what they're watching in the YouTube clips and all those other things. That parents and adults have less and less impact into the growing of a young person. And it's really all these media images that are teaching them and telling them how to be. They go to this world of quote-unquote entertainment, looking for the answers to their question of who am I, how should I behave, how should I be with other people, what does it mean to be a man, what does it mean to be a woman, etc., etc. Which is why we need to be aware of those messages and try to counter them in a positive way. The most recent survey of this was done by the Kaiser Family Foundation. And this was a few years ago. This was about 3 years ago, so they're due for another one. They do these things every 5 years. And what they found a few years ago is that the average teenager spends 7 hours and 38 minutes a day consuming some kind of media content. That's a stunning statistic. They said this is almost the amount of time most adults spend at work each day, except that young people use media 7 days a week instead of 5. Moreover, they go on to say, given the amount of time they spend using more than one medium at a time, today's youth pack a total of 10 hours and 45 minutes into those 7.5 hours, which is an increase of almost 2.25 hours of their previous study, which was just 5 years before. They see the world through screens. You know, they're always looking. Even when something's exciting happening, what do? They pull out their phone. And they don't look at it live, they look at it through the screen. And they're recording it, and they're sending it, and they're Snapchatting it, and they're Instagramming it. And they're doing all these things because that's just the way that they're programmed. Many sociologists have coined the phrase, they're digital natives, that this is the world they grew into, which was just a life of digital communication and all these other things. Now, this is kind of a scary statistic. You think like, oh my gosh, like that's a lot. It's even interesting, you know, Netflix, I was told recently, you know, they have this theme now called Watch Responsibly, that if you watch like a few hours of Netflix in a row, they've now put up a, are you still watching? And they'll make you watch a commercial. Some of you are smiling because you must have done this. They'll make you watch a little commercial about maybe you should get off your butt and go do something and not watch all 6 seasons of Lost, you know, at the same time. And, you know, we have this binge mentality now. Many young people have this binge mentality when it comes to this. They just watch and watch and watch. I have a teenage son. He's 15 years old. And he will have Netflix. I'll go upstairs to see what he's up to. He'll have Netflix on the TV. He'll have his iPad on, listening to Pandora. He'll be texting his friends, you know, and he'll be doing all of this at once, you know. And this is, for him, this is the world he grew up in. Like, he's just kind of used to that. And we have restrictions on media. You know, we only let him do it like 2 hours a day, and he just really makes the most of those 2 hours, you know, when he's there. But there's a lot of families that have no restrictions. They just come home and boop, 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 and they're plugged in until they go to bed. And that needs to tell us something about young people and how to reach them. Because if they're that plugged into media, we really need to find more creative ways, again, to find the seed of the Word of God within those messages. Try to pull them out. I always feel like before I ever want to critique media or critique the culture, I want to find 2 or 3 really good things to say about it before I say anything that's of a critique. Because again, from a Christian perspective, it's so easy to critique. And from somebody now 20 years removed, 30 years removed from being a teenager, you know, it's easier for me as to be like, oh, I can't believe you guys watch so much TV. Click. You've just alienated the entire group. You know, you've just made them think, well, you're one of those people, you know, who aren't connected with it. So this understanding that they are media born and bred, not just born and bred, but branded. Many sociologists have noticed that this is the most marketed to generation in the history of humanity. Commercial after commercial after commercial. I just held up my iPhone. It's a good example of branding. When you own an Apple product, what Apple wants you to do is not just own a product, but feel like you're a part of a community. I've known people that, well, you work at an Apple store, so you know what's going on. You work for Apple. That's part of the psychology of a lot of things. I got a backup battery for my iPhone a few years ago. It was from a company called Mophie. Did I say that right? I'm looking at the Apple guy. And it was a backup battery, and I pulled the battery out, and on the back of this cardboard packaging, it said, "Mophie loves you." And I took the battery, I'm like, do you really? But this is actually the way branding works. Mophie was trying to get me have an emotional connection. That'll be like, I love Mophie. I hate Belkin, but I love Mophie. And in many ways, young people are just brought up with this, commercial after commercial after commercial. They want to brand them when they're very young. And the goal of these advertisers is to keep them as young as they can, as long as they can. Because young people have a disposable income. It's a huge moneymaker. Once you get married and have these things called children, you actually start thinking about spending money on them and like diapers and stuff like that. But if we can keep you single in your parents' basement, playing video games all the time, sorry if I'm calling some people out, this is the mentality. And this is part of media has been driving this. We're in a bizarre sociological state with youth culture because 100 years ago there was no such thing as youth culture. When you were 14 or 15, you started to work. You were married when you were 17 or 18 on average. Today, that's like a reality TV show on MTV. But back then, that was normal. Today, you will have people who are 28 years old. They're living in their parents' house. They'll have spent over $100,000 on education, and they will look at you with a straight face and say, I'm not sure what I want to do with my life. People from previous centuries would be like, what? How can you not know that when you're 28 and you spent that much time in others? Hey, I work for a college. I'm grateful that I teach catechetics. It's a major. We try to empower people into a career. But most college is just this idea of liberal arts education. I remember when I graduated college, I went to a place called Rollins College. It's just a little bit north of Orlando and a little bit left of hell. And I remember the commencement speaker stood up and said, what you have learned here is that you have learned how to learn. And I just thought, I spent that much money learning how to learn. I knew how to learn. You didn't teach me anything, and that's a real challenge. That's a real challenge today where this media, this branding, this marketing does not want them to grow up, does not want them to take responsibility. Is telling them that you just need to live in the now, live in the pleasure, live in the moment. You got plenty of time to figure out what you're going to be later. It'll actually probably happen by default because there's no jobs anyway. And 10 and a half hours a day, they're being told this. And we get like an hour and a half with them on a Sunday if they show up. It's a challenge. The beautiful thing is we're telling the truth. The beautiful thing is that what we are inviting them to, empowering them to, is something greater than being the consumer and the couch potato that media is telling them to be and media is calling them to do. But we have to be very sensitive to the media they watch and they take in, and if we're creative and clever, we'll find ways of using that media to proclaim the gospel and to engage them, in their faith life. You might have heard this phrase. This is another very important thing you need to know about young people. Some of you are saying, yes, so you know this one. In 2005, there was a book released called Soul Searching. By the way, it's already out of date because it was 9 years ago. But this idea that Christian Smith coined when he did a survey of the religiosity of young people. And he phrased it as moral therapeutic deism, that no matter what denomination, whether they were Mormon or evangelical or conservative Protestant or Catholic or Jewish or whatever, that most young people had this kind of religiosity to them. And I think it's a great thing to know because it's a starting point. St. Paul, when he was writing to Timothy, in the first letter to Timothy, he wrote this. He said, nope, I wrote that wrong. It's actually 2 Timothy. So if you're making notes, it's 2 Timothy. He said, before God and before Christ Jesus, who is to be judged living and dead, I charge you in the name of his appearing, proclaim the message, and welcome or unwelcome, insist on it. Another translation is in season or out of season. Refute falsehood, correct error, give encouragement. The time is sure to come when people will not accept sound teaching, but their ears will be itching for anything new, and they will collect themselves a whole series of teachers according to their own tastes. They will shut their ears to the truth and will turn to myths. One of the things about the internet doesn't actually help you learn things. The internet is a place where you can find people who already think what you're thinking and help you justify it. That's what the internet does. It doesn't lead you to truth. It just helps you reinforce the opinions you already had because somebody posted it on a blog or somebody made a video about it. And young people think they can Google something and find the truth, and they're not finding the truth. What they're doing is exactly what St. Paul was warning St. Timothy about. They're just going to accumulate teachers according to their own tastes. The internet is a great place to accumulate teachers according to your own tastes. You can super convince yourself that you're right just because you found somebody else who said what you always thought was the case. And that's one of the driving things about this moral therapeutic deism, is that when you look at the creed, as Christian Smith explained it, it really is finding people that just agree with what you say. Here's the 5 points of the apostolic creed of moral therapeutic deism, so to speak. The first one is a God exists who created and orders the world and watches over human life on earth. Atheism is actually quite rare, statistically, at least in the United States. Agnosticism is really popular. Most people would say, oh, I think there's a God, and he created everything. You know, actually, like in every survey and every stat, adults and teens kind of just nod their head and all like, yeah. And what about this God? Well, that's the second point. God wants people to be good, nice, and fair to each other, as taught in the Bible and in most world religions. Who doesn't like do unto others as you would have them do unto you? The goal of spirituality is to be cool to each other, to be nice to each other. I remember that Jason Everett, who's a very popular chastity speaker, when he was talking about many times Catholics are confused, older Catholics are confused at this younger generation because they are very pro-life. But they're also very pro-same-sex marriage. Now, it's like, wait a second. Like from a Catholic theology standpoint, those things are different, but not for a young person. See, a young person just feels like you shouldn't be mean to people. That's the driving issue. So killing a baby is mean. And denying people who have same-sex attraction to get married is also mean. And for them, it's the same moral issue. We should just let people be, and we should be good to each other. This goes to the third point. The central goal of life is to be happy and feel good about yourself. That's the therapeutic thing. The next point, God doesn't need to be particularly involved in one's life except when God is needed to resolve a problem. That's the deism part. Now, the deism of the 18th century was the idea that God created the world and sent it spinning and kind of steps back. The deism of teenagers today is that God really just lets you live your life most of the time, unless you're really, really desperate, and he'll kind of be like, oh, okay, I'll come help. But for the most part, God is distant. He doesn't really participate. Like how you're going to get through school, how you're going to get through day-to-day activities. He's too busy like saving people or doing other stuff like that to worry about your day-to-day life. Very different from the God that knows every hair on our head that Jesus revealed. And finally, the last point is that good people go to heaven when they die. There's not really a concern about salvation. Because, well, if you're good, and what does good mean? Well, better than the murderer. Like everybody, what's the song? Was it Kenny Chesney? Everybody wants to go to heaven, but nobody wants to go now. It's that idea that, well, pretty much, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, we're all going to go to heaven, right? As I've actually done a lot of studies of documents written in the 80s and 90s in the U.S., this was a very strong drive that there's an avoidance of talking about heaven or hell. There's an avoidance of talking about sin. There's almost a feeling like that's a Protestant thing to do, and we don't want to scare young people. But the good news isn't good unless the bad news is really bad. And if you don't want to talk about sin, then you can't talk about grace. And if you don't want to talk about hell, you can't talk about heaven or salvation. And then suddenly the most important thing that Christ did on the cross, which is to save us from hell, to bring us to heaven, doesn't really mean that much anymore because, if you're just a good person. And at that point, why Christianity over Buddhism, over Islam, over whatever, There's no point to it. It's just Jesus was a really good person and he taught us how to live. And many young people, when they approach their faith, will sum it up like this. They won't use the phrase, I'm a moral therapeutic deist. But they'll sum it up like, well, what does God want of you? He wants me to be good and nice to people. Why do you come to youth group? Why do you come to church? It makes me feel good about myself. I like doing service projects because I feel better about who I am. What's your relationship with God? I really like God. I think he's cool. He's not a part of my day-to-day activity. I'm not going to have him come in on decisions like where am I going to college or who am I going to date or what am I going to do this Saturday night. But, if somebody has cancer, I will seriously pray. And I'm sure he'll help out or do something. You're laughing because you know teenagers like this. But it's good to see this. There's another book that I quoted earlier, Almost Christian, and she called it benign whateverism. That's how she summarized the religiosity of American teenagers. She said, young people are theoretically fine with religious faith, but it doesn't concern them very much. They think it's cool, but it's kind of like, yeah, whatever. They don't want to tick God off, and they're just not that enthusiastic about it. And I think some of the reasons why they're not enthusiastic about it is because they're not hearing the fullness of the truth of the gospel. There's no stakes. There's no drive. There's no proclamation that really leads them, to what's going on. There's a wonderful book that I encourage you to read. It's called Hurt 2.0. You don't have to read 1.0, by a guy named Chap Clark. And he actually argues against some of these statistics. He says, on the surface, the adolescent world appears to be relatively stable and healthy, yet beneath the calm waters presented by positive empirical data, there is a turmoil that is difficult, painful, lonely, and even harmful to young people. Even among those who argue that adolescents are basically fine, virtually no one would question the need that young people, especially adolescents, have for adults who are available, who care, and who come to them without a hidden or self-centered agenda. The fact is that adolescents need adults to become adults. And when adults are not present and involved in their lives, they are forced to figure out how to survive life on their own. He goes on to say that he feels like young people have suffered from a systematic abandonment from the adult world, the adult culture. We put them in high schools. We put them in these environments. Many times the high schools, they're involved in so many activities that it pulls them away from families, and it becomes a Lord of the Flies, where their only model of being an adult comes from somebody who's just a year or two older than they are. The freshmen look up to the seniors. That's what they think being an adult is. And this is the power that we have in youth ministry, is being adults in their world. They desperately need adults to become adults. It should be no surprise that so many young people are not becoming adults because they have very little contact, positive contact with adults. For most young people, their most positive contact with an adult is a coach. But of course, that depends on their ability. That's for the star players. If you don't make the team, you just don't get that contact. In many ways, you're ostracized or feel rejected or these other things that are going on. So there's some significant issues that are going on with our young people. And this also ties back to what Christian Smith was saying. He said, they sound Christian. This was the whole theme of Kendra Casey Dean's book, Almost Christian. They seem like they're Christian. They'll say things like, we need to be good to each other, do unto you, do unto another as you want them to do unto you. They speak some of the language of Christianity, but when it gets down to the crux of it, they're not. They're just almost. She uses the phrase, they're Christian-ish. They use that language, and we get a lot of people in our youth groups that are Christian-ish. And really, their mentality is more cultural than it is Christian. And they're struggling and they're suffering because they look like they're doing really well. And yet, in this world beneath, they just don't have a clue of what's going on. It leads them also to a postmodern mentality. This also is from Hurt. He says, many of the ethical standards of adult society have secondary relevance for mid-adolescence. It's not that they don't care about the traditional ethical issues, such as lying, cheating, and stealing, but they can be easily discarded if they violate the more pressing ethical standards of the adolescent world. For a young person, cheating is just not a big deal. Sadly, the stats are that almost all of them do it. And when they interview people about it, young people about it, they'll blame the teacher. The teacher didn't prepare me well enough for that. And their whole goal is that they need to achieve. They need to get the good grade. Because you know what? Somebody else in the class is teaching and they're going to get an A. I'm not going to get a B+ after I've studied. And this guy who doesn't study at all is going to get an A. I need the A because I need to get to college. They do that immorally in so many ways. Lying, they have no problem lying to their parents. And they don't consider it a moral issue. Because they would say, if my parents really knew where I was, they'd get upset. And I don't want to upset them. That wouldn't be nice. Again, this goes back to this relative. I don't want to upset them because I know I'm safe and I know I'm fine. And if they knew all the details, they'd just get really bent out of shape. And that wouldn't be cool. So they have no problem lying. They have no problem cheating. They have no problem doing these things that as adults we go, oh, you're not supposed to do that. And the young people shrug their shoulders and are like, well, whatever. And this happens even with our great Christian kids, our most active kids. They'll be involved in our youth group with a smile on their face and seem like the most model citizen. And they won't be that much different. There's been a number of statistics that have gone around in the Protestant world that says that kids in youth groups aren't really less sexually active than the kids in youth groups. And that's just part of the challenge of it. He goes on to say that adults at least nod towards an acceptance of ethical behaviors, but typically will have a harder time admitting it. If we're honest with ourselves as adults, we can kind of lie and cheat and steal and do stuff. We just don't like saying it out loud. One research stated, adolescents have been hardened by today's realities. They've seen an acceptance of disposing of ethics and morals if it serves a need. They see it is okay to do what you want to do as long as you meet your personal requirements. I don't know how many of you watched the show Breaking Bad. I only saw a few episodes. I wasn't addicted to Breaking Bad as some people were. One of the fascinating things about Breaking Bad, though, it's an interesting study in morality. With the exception of the finale, every moral decision that was made in Breaking Bad was a matter of survival. That it was about people pinned against a wall, a moral choice, and they would always make the choice that led to their own survival, even if it led to the destruction of others. And that's what the show was about, season after season after season. Isn't it interesting that it became so popular? How did this show resonate so much and become such a blockbuster show? Because that's the way many people choose their own morality. That they'll be good as long as it doesn't threaten their survival. And once it threatens their survival, and if we're honest, we're all like this. This is where we get tempted. You know, it doesn't threaten my survival to lie on my tax form when I know I should be getting a bunch of money anyway. But if I feel like, oh, maybe I'll have to pay the government, well, now I'm tempted. You know, now I'm like, well, maybe I didn't, you know, and this is human. You know, this is the human reality of it. And young people see adults do it. The modeling by adults has served to further erode a commitment to live up to the lofty standards of an ethical rhetoric. And it's not just their moms and dads, if they're blessed to have their moms and dads still together. I mean, I remember trying to teach chastity to it's hard to teach chastity to young people when their mom has their boyfriend who's living with them, right? I mean, they go home and this is the world in which they live. It's very, very difficult. But they also see this through the media, the 10.5 hours a day. Like, can you really think of what are good ethical role models in these TV shows that they're watching? Education is entertainment. And this is why our witness and our involvement in their life is so important, because they just don't see it. And the biggest thing is that they're just stressed out. This is one thing that every survey on millennials finds about young people. Even if they think they're behaving well, their stress level is through the roof. This is from Frank Mercandante's book, Engaging a New Generation. They spend more time studying and take heavier course loads in school than previous generations. They're more educated than anybody, and yet they know less of what to do than anybody. They're painfully aware their present performance directly impacts their future opportunities. Past generations were anxious about nuclear war, violence, and AIDS. Today, the greatest source of anxiety for teens is their grades and getting into a good college. With fierce competition for the best colleges, many teens overload on a four-course menu of academics, extracurricular activities, sports, and volunteerisms. Many teens choose their multiple involvements based on how it will look on their college resume. I have a 15-year-old boy, and he's already talking to me about, you know, he's involved in the Key Club. And I thought, oh, that's really cool, service stuff. And I said, that's great that you're doing that. He said, yeah, it's really a pain, but it'll look good on my college resume. I thought, like, who told you that? You know, like, it's just crazy that that's what they're told. Hey, get involved in this. It'll look great in your college resume. You really need to be involved in at least one or two sports. Hey, it's competitive out there. I just read an article. I don't know where I read it because I read everything on the internet, and I believe everything I read on the internet. That's a quote from Abraham Lincoln. But it was this idea that like the top schools are turning away 95% of the applicants. And some of that's because students who are convinced they're not going to get into any school will apply to 20 schools. So the applications are through the roof. And even these college people who do admissions are saying, you know, there's not that much of a difference. Like from who we rejected. You know, they were talking to one student who got rejected from Stanford but got into Yale. Like, why? There's no reason for it. There's just so many applicants. And there's this feeling, this pressure of I've got to be involved in, like, I have to have a resume. I mean, God bless them. They feel like they have to be 18 and have a resume of all of these activities and things they did and this pressure. My 15-year-old son is feeling this pressure. I'm like, dude, you're going to Franciscan. Don't worry about it. I know people. You know, I'm not trying to say that Franciscan's not academically challenging or passionately Catholic. I'm just saying I work there and I think he can get in. But that's it. Listen to this description. It's so true. To manage their busy schedules, many teens tote various organizers. High school athletic success often hinges on years of previous competitive experience in a sport. I remember that my son wanted to get involved in football. I'm glad he didn't. And there was like a Pee-wee football league. And we didn't want him involved in it. We just thought we'd want to wait a few years. And I was told by many parents, if he's not in the Pee-wee league, he's not going to play high school. Like, you got to get in now. It's like, I don't need that pressure in my life. you know? But this is constant. You're nodding your heads because you know what's going on, but this is different. This is a pressure that many of us did not have, and it is constant. They're not worried about AIDS or world wars or other stuff like that. They don't remember 9/11. You know, they were like 5, you know, when that happens. You know, they were still watching Elmo, you know, when that was going on. It's all about the pressure to succeed, the pressure to move forward, the pressure to be successful. All of those things are really going on in a young person's life. And so the peace of Christ that we can offer, we can't be tricked by the false read of their morality. Because sometimes, unfortunately, you know, you always have to ask our question, why am I doing youth ministry? And if the goal of doing youth ministry is to help them to be a more moral person, well, then we don't really need to do youth ministry as much anymore. And I've heard people make that argument, by the way. Teens aren't in as much of a crisis as they were in the 90s. Youth ministry is not as necessary as it was back then, because nationwide youth ministry has gone into decline. Now, sadly, much of that has been the brunt of sexual scandals. You know, not the need for the ministry, but people will point to some of those statistics and say, yeah, they're actually doing pretty good. I would go with Hurt 2.0, Chap Clark, some of these other people that would say, actually, they're more desperate than ever. They're faking us out with some of the language of Christianity, but they don't know Christ, and they don't know the peace that Christ can give. They've been abandoned by an entire adult culture, and they're left to fend for themselves in this youth culture that seems to have no end because no one's showing them what it means to be an adult and what it means to be a follower of Jesus Christ. And that brings me to the last point. They need Jesus, and they need you. Millennials have not found some magic cure to not need Jesus Christ, even though they might act that way. They might have this benign whateverism that's present. In the beginning of the Gospel of John, we hear about the incarnation. You're very familiar with this verse, I'm sure, but it's always just so worth reading out loud. That in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God, He was with God in the beginning. Through Him all things came into being, not one thing came into being except through Him. What has come into being in Him was life. That life was the light of men, and light shines in the darkness. And the darkness cannot overpower it. We have to have that conviction. Light shines in the darkness, and darkness doesn't overpower it. The Word became flesh. He lived among us. We saw His glory. How did God minister to us? He came into the midst of our darkness, into the midst of our culture, and He showed us a new way to live. He was a model for holiness. I remember Fulton Sheen once made the analogy of the Old Testament to the New. He said the Old Testament was like radio, and the New Testament was like television. You know, in the Old Testament, it was just a voice. And in the New Testament, you could see it. If he was writing today, he'd probably say like a 3D Blu-ray, or something like that, where he's really present. But this is what we do in youth ministry. That we get to enter into this culture and walk amongst their culture. And we bring this witness of life. One quote from Paul VI that we make all our catechetics majors memorize is that modern man listens more willingly to witnesses than to teachers, and to teachers only if they are witnesses. They don't need more theology from us. They need to see a changed life first. They need to be able to look at us and say, oh, that's different. Wow, that's very different from what I'm watching in the media or what is going on in my school. They need to see a joy in us. St. Peter said that always have ready, proclaim Christ the Lord wholly in your heart, and always have ready a reason for the hope that you have received. His exhortation to evangelize was based on, if you are living the faith, the joy of the gospel, which is what Francis is talking about and wrote so beautifully about, that that joy of the gospel, then people ask us, where did you get that joy? How are you so satisfied? How have you found that fulfillment? Where did you get the thing that everybody is looking for? And the answer is rooted in Jesus Christ, that we witness to this first and foremost. That's the missionary attitude. We just live and dwell among young people. And they see everything. I mean, it's frightening how much they see. But they see everything. And when they see somebody genuine, somebody loving, somebody faithful, the conversations will start. It won't happen immediately. It takes a while to, as a famous Young Life phrase, to earn the right to be heard. We have to be very patient with that. We have to continually share things that we've encountered in their culture in a non-judgmental way that makes them start to go, oh, okay, you kind of have an idea of what's going on in my culture. We never try to act like a teenager because we're not. And you know what? They don't need it. They need adults, loving adults. You know, that 80s and 90s stereotype of the youth ministers, the one with the Ray-Bans and like the hip lingo, and that's gone, and I'm glad that's gone because I never actually was very good at that anyway. But there was this attitude that, oh, well, if you really want to reach young people, you've got to act like a hip, slick young person. No, actually you don't. You didn't then, I think, but you really don't need to today. You just need to be yourself, but be yourself as a missionary that is willing to listen to the music and watch the shows and talk about it and be present to young people and just listen to young people. I think so many times we're just so caught up in what we want them to hear as opposed to really just saying, well, what do you want to say? They're so desperate to belong and be a part of a community. And we just need to be more patient, to meet them where they're at and to love them and connect. Because the invitation to follow Jesus Christ, and this is something that's a little different from our Protestant brothers and sisters, is it's not just a personal one-on-one relationship, though that's an important part of it. It's an invitation to a community. We are a church. We are a family. The sacramental life, the celebrations, all of those things. This is really what young people are longing for. Millennials are longing for. They're looking for a place to belong. Why are they so willing to be branded as this thing or that thing? It's because they want an identity. The marketing world is giving them lots of different identities to choose from. But we are giving them a true identity. And the challenge is to really bring them deeper into that faith, into that life, because we don't want them to just have a youth group religion and be branded as a youth grouper. That might not be a bad initial evangelization start. But we want to find a way to pull them into the deeper community, into the deeper life. Many young people, the stats, they go to college, they lose their faith. And I think you could argue that they might not have had their faith going into college. They might not have lost anything. It was just that you just realized at that point, without the trappings of the community, what was going on in their heart and their life. And it's heartbreaking. We've all been there as youth ministers, kids that we thought were just rock solid and really faithful. And they go to college and they come back with a weird tattoo and, a dumb drinking name and, other stuff, like that. And you're like, oh, man, what happened to you? And sometimes it's just young people are going to survive and mold themselves into whatever environment they are. They've learned to be adaptable. So while they were hanging out with the youth group, they acted like a youth group kid. But there weren't youth group kids at college. There was this drinking group, this drug-doing group. And they just survived. Because sadly, that element of survival and abandonment is a huge issue for young people. All we can do is be faithful. All we can do is love them where they're at, challenge them, encourage them, reach out to them. Many of these elements, I'm sure you've known all these things. I'm just trying to articulate some of the things you've experienced, and maybe just a reminder. That young people, millennials are not like us. We have to approach them with a missionary mentality. That we have to realize that their currency, their language is all based on media, and if we're not engaging in that somehow, we're missing out on a powerful way to communicate the gospel message to them. This idea of being moral and therapeutic and deistic, we want to acknowledge that and go beyond that and try to challenge them in very positive ways to a God who's intimately personal in every moment of their life. That's so much better than moral therapeutic deism, you know? Because God just doesn't want to be a spiritual drug pusher all the time and make us feel good about ourselves. Because if that's their entire experience of the faith, they're just going to move on to those other things that are happening in their life. They need Jesus. And they need us. They need us as adults. And what they need, John Paul II said this in 93. I think his words still resonate today. In his World Day of Vocations, he said, "This is what is needed, a church for young people, which will know how to speak through their heart and enkindle comfort and inspire enthusiasm in it with the joy of the gospel and the strength of the Eucharist. A church which will know how to invite and to welcome the person who seeks a purpose for which to commit his whole existence. A church which is not afraid to require much after having given much, which does not fear of asking from young people the effort of a noble and authentic adventure, such as that of following the gospel." I love this line that it's not afraid to require much after having given much. That really makes an invitation. I think so many times the problem with our catechesis is that we've turned it into customer service. And we try to soften the areas that we think would be unpalatable to a young person. We're almost too afraid to challenge and to offer something different from the culture. Being mindful of the culture and using the culture to proclaim the gospel is not a way of watering down our faith. It's just finding a language and an imagery and a community through which we can build a church for young people that can speak to their heart and enkindle comfort and inspire enthusiasm with the joy of the gospel and the strength of the Eucharist. That needs to be our attitude as missionaries, that we want to build this church for young people, no matter what the generation is. There's a lot of things different about millennials than Generation Xers, than the boomers, than the greatest generation, than the silents, than whatever else we characterize these generations as. But the universal thing is that we all are desperate for the love of God. And we're desperate for people to show us that love. And so I'm so grateful of the ministry you're doing and the work you're doing, and even just being willing to come out here on a Wednesday night and hear me talk in the hopes that maybe there was something that was said, something that was shared that might inspire, empower, and kindle you to do even more effective ministry with young people.